Hello, I'm Aria from Liberal Reform. We promote personal liberty, free markets and globalism within the Liberal Democrats. You can find out more about us here. We've interviewed each of the contenders to be our London mayoral candidate. You'll hear a little bit about their experience, their plans and their policies, and we hope you find these useful in deciding how to cast your vote.
So a little bit about me and my background. Well, most people in the Liberal Democrats know me for most recently standing as the parliamentary candidate in the Lewisham East by-election. Was very proud to stand for the Liberal Democrats there. We managed to take the fight to Labour quite spectacularly, 20% swing, very proud of that. About me a little bit more generally. So I work in the international development and humanitarian sector, and I've worked in that sector for all of my working life. And I'm a conflict specialist, so I work with organisations across the world on very diverse things, whether that's research, training on prevention of violent extremism, conflict analysis, but a lot of it is about how you do programming in conflict zones, how do you do programming that helps build peace between communities. I do a lot of work with faith communities on those issues as well. I'm a born and bred Londoner. I've lived here all my life. South East London, Lewisham, funnily enough. So that's a little bit about me. Well, I have always been a Liberal, and I've always voted Liberal Democrat at any election I can think of. I've always voted Liberal Democrats. And so my choice to join the party, which I think was even potentially less than 3 years ago, was about me being ready to get involved rather than, a sudden seeing of the light. Liberal Democrats have always reflected my values and my policy choices, and I was always very happy to vote for the party. I joined pre-Brexit but post the 2015 election. And I feel like I'm probably one of the few people I know who's joined within this rafter period who wasn't, spurred on by, the loss of our MPs or Brexit or whatever it happens to be. So I would say that I'm very much a Lib Dem. I'm very much a liberal Democrat, and I'm a member of this party because of the values it holds. Well, I've been, I think most of us in London have spent a long time being very frustrated and probably moving quite swiftly on to anger at the way in which our city is developing. We've had a series of self-promoting mayors who, frankly, look like they've got their eye on their next job instead of the needs of London today. So one of the wealthiest cities in the world, deep inequality. And I've grown up, I grew up in areas which are very diverse in terms of different socioeconomic groups. So I've grown up right next to where some of the poverty is worst in the city, and I've also been spending a lot of my time in places where people are very wealthy in the city. And I look around my home today, and for the first time in my life, people I grew up with are saying that either they can't afford or they don't want to live in London anymore. None of us ever thought we would say that. There's a huge number of people who are moving out. It's become completely unaffordable for people who are pretty much on an average income. And that's even before you start looking at the most appalling levels of poverty. So I've worked in places that have the kind of poverty that you cannot believe exists in the century we're in. And to find out that there are children living in the same kind of level of poverty that I see elsewhere in the world is just heartbreaking. And it's unacceptable that we have a mayor, we have an assembly that isn't putting that front and centre of what they're about. If a London mayor isn't there to tackle 37% of our children living under the poverty line, I don't know why we have one. And so what I wanted to do was to enable us to, as a party, to stand up on those issues, stand up for London's values, stand up for our party, and really have a campaign that campaigns on the issues that really matter to Londoners. That was probably the first thing that made me want to stand to be our candidate so that I could talk about those issues, so that I could persuade the party to talk about those issues as well. My message would actually be about the values that London represents. London is one of the most cosmopolitan and vibrant cities in the world. It's why I'm proud to be a Londoner. This is why I love my city so much. It's not just the diversity, but our welcoming of diversity, our, just the sheer myriad of cultures and, different communities that we have represented in our city. We have a liberal city, and to my mind, we've had two parties who fail to represent liberal values. I mean, they may say they do. They talk about, oh yes, we're very liberal and we're very progressive in this way, but you scratch the surface and they're not like us. Liberal Democrats stand up for liberal values, and so for me the message would be that it's about time that London had a party that reflects its values and doesn't just pay lip service to the issues that are really important to people living in London. Solving the housing crisis is going to be a generational battle now, and I think we have to have an honest conversation about that. I know the word gets bandied around a lot, but unless we start thinking of really radical solutions to how we approach housing in the city, we're not going to get to the point we want to. And solving the housing crisis, yes, it is about building more houses, yes, but that is nowhere near the complexity of the full set of issues we're facing. So I want to separate housing from homelessness as two separate policy areas. So looking at housing, one of the things I'm very passionate about is to get away from just talking about affordable housing, in inverted commas. I've yet to see really affordable housing that is actually affordable, and start talking not just about social housing, but also about cooperative housing, talking about temporary ways of having prefab housing over short periods of time, lots of different ways in which we can look at how we house ourselves that aren't just in the simple block style that Labour tends to go for. And it's not just about ownership, as the Tories tend to go for. We need to have a range of solutions to the housing crisis, because no two families in London are alike, and the idea that we're all going to be well catered for by the same block housing over and over again is frankly ludicrous. Right? We don't look enough at different ways in which people are choosing to connect their lives together. So I'm particularly passionate about cooperative housing, because you end up with very affordable ways in which different families of different sizes can build a community together over a long period of time, and can sustainably build their community around that. But also, if you start a family, you might move to a different area in the cooperative. There's lots of different ways in which you can organise this. So I know that the London Policy Commission that has been set up for the party I was part of the discussion that talked about what our new housing policy, the first discussion on what our new housing policy might be. And I'm really excited about the fact that we have a lot of people in the party who are not only experts in this, but come with really interesting and new ideas. And I think that's the way forward. So yes, we've got to build houses, but we've also got to look at the different ways in which we can build housing. We have to get away from the obsession with house ownership. It's unsustainable. We have to look at social housing rather than affordable housing, and we have to look at different ways in which people build their lives together in communities, such as cooperative housing. Homelessness, to take that aside, personally I would prefer for the party to campaign to implement a housing first model like the one that they've used in Finland. There's been a very interesting study on how that could be implemented in Liverpool, and it was found to be, over the long term, significantly more cost effective and more effective in actually solving homelessness than a lot of other ways in which we can approach this. This is a big city. I would love to see a housing first approach done across the whole city, and I would like to see that not just for homelessness but also for hidden homelessness, people who are not necessarily visibly on the streets, also for those who are vulnerable in terms of housing and likely to be thrown out of their housing within short basis. That would be ideal, but I'm also aware that this is a very big city and that's a very big ask, so we may need to do it in smaller areas first. we have the kind of capacity to do that in a city like London, like other cities don't, because we can do it in different areas, and also because the areas are different in different ways. We could actually do a whole series of different approaches that can then be used in different parts of the country to help with homeless problems elsewhere. So for me, the fact that time after time people are promising to end homelessness and then they don't even scratch the surface, and now it's getting worse, is unacceptable. And I would like to see us look at really big solutions to this, because people can't afford to wait. So I believe there's two answers to your question there. The first is that we need to look at solutions that work now. So, for example, people who are talking about what people want, people who are in rented accommodation often want good quality accommodation. There's a question of wanting to be in good quality accommodation now, right? Loved the idea that the current mayor has of having an accreditation scheme. Why the hell is it not compulsory? Housing and quality housing is a human right. I work in the humanitarian sector. Having a certain level of shelter is a human right, and we don't approach it on that basis. So in terms of what people want, I think we also need to look at what people want now as well as what they want in the future. So people want a house over their heads now. They may want home ownership, but that will definitely come second to having safe and quality housing at this particular moment. When I talk about radical solutions, we are dealing with this particular moment and people needing housing right now. And so when I talk about wanting to focus not just on home ownership, I'm talking about a real solution that works at this particular moment. When it comes to the fact that people prefer home ownership, I do wonder, actually, if as a society we need to have a difficult conversation with ourselves about the sustainability of what we want. We haven't, the right to buy and all of those things are fantastic and for the people who benefited from them, but the long-term implications of that have been deeply damaging for the way in which our housing market works and the way in which wealth is being built up over long periods of time. We have to look at new ways of doing that, and the land value tax is a good way of doing that as well. So the first answer to your question is that when I talk about getting these solutions now and not necessarily focusing on home ownership, it's because I want to focus on solutions that matter to people right now and getting good quality homes with good quality roofs over their head. When it comes to the future, I think we need to have difficult conversations about what we want and whether or not that's actually achievable along with everything else that we want in terms of sustainable housing, especially with the rise of population growth in London. So transport policy takes many different forms. Improving transport, I think a lot of it has to do with actually looking at transport in terms of what people need, rather than necessarily looking at it purely from a cost-effective point of view. So, for example, our recent campaign on the closures of different bus routes. Overwhelmingly, people who use buses are from lower incomes. A large number of the routes that are being closed may not have been particularly well used, some of them, but they were used by people who completely rely on them in order to get to work. Transport in London primarily is to enable our economy to function, because so many of us have to travel for so much further in order to get to our jobs. So I do think that improving transport in London also involves having a look at what people need, sometimes over what necessarily is cost effective in some cases. And the buses are a perfect example of that, particularly the closures that have been proposed. In terms of management of TfL, I'm not going to spend time talking here about various failures in oversight and management, but TfL is in a very serious financial situation. I think that there's a difficult conversation to be had in terms of balancing out the affordability, because people in London are getting, we're getting poorer. People with actually quite decent incomes are struggling to, they're feeling vulnerable about how they can make ends meet. filling that funding gap, the easy way would be, okay, so we'll increase fares and that will be it. But the fact is that people rely on this day after day, and if you raise fares, it's not a choice that people make. People don't choose the type of transport that they get. They choose public transport to get to work, because that's the route that gets them to work. Looking at ways in which we can fill that funding gap, and going back to what I said about making child poverty one of the key metrics on what we're doing, we need to look at the cost of public transport for different groups that are potentially in poverty. We need to look at the cost, of making sure that young people are able to access affordable transport. We need to take a serious look about how free transport for over 65s works and things like that. The fact is that at the moment the finances of TfL are unsustainable, and we're going to have yet another difficult conversation about how do we fill that gap while also meeting the needs of Londoners for the future. And I have to say I don't have any simple answers for that. I think that that's going to be an ongoing conversation over the next 10 years. And we will be hamstrung by the choices that are made by the current person in office right now. When it comes to transport options such as cycle lanes or hackney cabs or Uber or black cabs, those have specific issues around, and those have specific issues that need to be addressed. And I think we need to, again, it's always about that balance. There's definitely about having a better environmental impact, but also it's about safety. So we want to have more cycle lanes, but we want to make sure that they're safe. We want to encourage people to do more walking and cycling, but we want to make sure it's done in an effective and safe manner. In the same way with taxis around London, this potentially won't make me popular with particular groups, but I believe that the future is coming very, very quickly in terms of the way in which transport is enabling us to, reform the way in which we use things like Uber is a perfect example of what's happening going to happen over the future in the way in which technology is going to change transport. Again, safety has to come first when it comes to companies like Uber. There is absolutely no reason why we can't have all the benefits of innovation while also maintaining proper regulation to ensure that people are safe. There is absolutely no reason why that shouldn't be a judgment that can be made for the benefit of people both ways. So I think there's some very exciting times ahead for transport. We have to also be very cautious not to over-rely on technology to solve all the problems for us. And I believe that any question about transport policy has to look at safety, and it also has to look at feasibility, and it has to look at how it impacts people's lives, and particularly people who rely on it day to day.
On that, do you agree with Sadiq Khan's Uber ban from last year, the year before?
Well, I believe it's been lifted now, yes. I believe that was a correct judgment at the time. I'm not privy enough to the level to which they've taken security seriously since then. And so I don't feel in a position to make an immediate judgment on, whether or not lifting the ban is sustainable. But I believe that while they're unable to provide basic levels of safety and security for their passengers, then that was absolutely the right call. Because at the end of the day, they're a regulator. They are there to regulate for our safety. So yes, that would be my position on that. Okay, so this is a big topic. So I will do my best not to get too bogged down into my professional opinion on these things. So there are two aspects of this that get that get people's attention. If I can take the question of police cuts first, absolutely that this has had a massive impact on why we're seeing escalating levels of violence. The way in which the Met has been expected to provide a level of service with, increasing reduction in numbers of the force, increasing reduction in community policing, increasing reduction in funding, is just appalling. We cannot expect to have the protection from the police that we want while we continue to strip them down in this particular way, and also to undertake things like very harmful restructuring approaches. So the one that comes to mind is, of course, the proposed merger of the police stations in Bromley, Sutton and Croydon. Now, Croydon is, if it wasn't on the outskirts of London, it would be a city in and of its own right. It is huge, and the idea of merging that with two other massive London boroughs is, frankly, I can't even believe that this came up on the table. Now, I understand that there's a desperate attempt to provide cuts wherever they can be made, but that should never be at the cost of public safety, and this will be at the cost of public safety. And so, our GLA campaign must be continuing to make fighting against closures of police stations, reduction in police services, a primary aspect of our campaign. Because people are less safe as a result, but we're finding that more and more crimes are going uninvestigated even where they are reported, because the Met is just completely stretched. So on the one side of tackling violence, there's obviously an issue to be dealt with in terms of enabling the Met to actually do their job. And at the moment, the choices that have been forced upon them by Sadiq Khan or by the Conservative government are not enabling them to do that. In terms of tackling violence at a community level, now, I've spent a lot of time working with different communities that have experienced violence that actually is quite similar to what we're seeing in London. And I have to say the warning signs were there a long time ago. They were there during the riots in 2011. Nothing was done. The violence has been rising since 2014, and only now is it getting to the point where people are starting to pay enough attention. And I have to say that the window in which we can look at prevention rather than response is closing. It's closing fast. The problem with tackling violence is that it's really complicated. It would be really nice if you could say, right, we're going to do this one thing and everything's going to be fine. Everyone's going to be happy and singing and dancing, and we'll be all, peaceful and loving, and all the kids will be really all right. No more carrying of knives. It doesn't work like that. What it is a complex set of scenarios which feeds into housing, economic opportunities, schooling, deprivation, but also social circles. Where do you get your validation from? Where do you get your social peer group validation? Who do you spend your time with? What are the most important aspects of the group that you spend your time with? And is there existing? Are you involved? Are you in the periphery of, say, gangs or drug trade, or any other aspects of criminal activity can also feed into this. No one aspect of those is going to be the reason why violence happens, but the solution involves all of those things together. So as you said, this ties into the question around child poverty, is that we have grossly failed the younger generations in this city. There's something like 40% of youth workers have been lost over the last 3-4 years. Certainly in my area, nearly all of the youth centres have been shut down, and it was only until there was an escalation in violence that the mayor came down and said, oh, here you go, here's some money to keep your youth centres. Only open for another year, by the way. Right? We have to completely reverse how we are approaching the fate of young people in our city, and we have to be realistic that the solutions aren't going to be one size fits all, and they're certainly not going to be simple. The reason why it's so important for the mayoral candidate to make Brexit a key part of our campaign is because the GLA team needs to show London what unequivocal opposition to Brexit looks like. None of this, oh yeah, I don't like Brexit, but my party says this. Oh, I'll try and stop the party doing this. Oh, I'll talk a bit about Brexit, but it's outside my control. No. London is a Remain city overwhelmingly. Right? London is going to be incredibly hard hit. This is by Brexit, just from, just look at the services industry within, all the city within London. London is particularly vulnerable to the impact of Brexit, and as yet, we've seen no solutions coming to those particular vulnerabilities, to our economy and to our city, and instead we're moving headlong towards a no-deal Brexit. I believe Londoners have been sold short in terms of real opposition to Brexit in our London mayor, and I believe that a Liberal Democrat team, led by our mayoral candidate, will be able to show London what real opposition to Brexit looks like. So, not quiet, no, like shouting and shouting and shouting and standing up and fighting as loud as we can and showing London what we can do if we really make a noise about this. So I believe it's hugely important for this campaign. And also, the campaign's going up to 2020. No matter what happens in March, 1st of April, the fight continues. 1st of April, the fight will continue, no matter what happens over the coming months. And the whole campaign will still be defined by the decisions that are made right now. And we have to continue fighting that. And London should be at the front of it, not tinkering around the edges going, okay, now I support people's vote. No, out there, right front and centre. So this is quite personal to me because I'm asthmatic and I have particular triggers based on the pollutants in the atmosphere. And a few years ago, there was still a failure within London to recognise the extent to which we'd exceeded the maximum level of pollutants in our air. And I knew that a good 2 years before they said anything about it. And the reason I knew was because I started to notice that I would get off the bus and I walk, not even 1.5 minutes to my front door. And I was starting to have an asthma attack every day in the 5 minutes the 1 minute from when I got off the bus to when I got to my front door, every day. And I knew that was because I was walking past a double junction and it was the pollution setting off an asthma attack every time. We really underestimate just how harmful what's in our air is. And it's not something we can choose to tackle. I know that there is yet another difficult conversation to be had about the balance between cost and having cleaner air, for example. Whether it be the low emission zone or all of that kind of thing. And I have to say that I believe we should come much further down on the side of sucking up the cost and making the air safe for our kids. I think we should look at very interesting policy solutions like, how many cars do we see parked and not used every single day? How many of us have cars that we don't actually need to drive? Are there ways in which we can incentivize, short-term car rental rather than owning a car? Are there ways in which we can improve the way in which we, reduce the number of cars on our road? Is there more we can do to improve the carbon footprint of public transport? How can we encourage more people onto public transport, which also would helpfully also help solve the TfL funding crisis as well? So I think there's lots of different ways in which we can do this, but some of them are going to be difficult, but it's the right choice to make.